They gave me a 10% chance of survival, where they said it was time to take me off the ventilator, stop the antibiotics, and just let me die.
Dr. Eben Alexander is a neurosurgeon who spent decades at some of the world's leading academic medical centers, and a man who once would have told you that near-death experiences were simply the dying brain playing tricks on you.
So I thought I understood brain-mind consciousness to some degree. I mean, I was teaching neurosurgery at Harvard Medical Schools. And then I had an absolutely life-changing, world-changing event.
Then his own brain shut down. In 2008, a rare bacterial meningitis sent him into a coma for 7 days.
There on day 7 of coma, that's when the doctors held the conference saying it's time to let me go. And it was a few hours later when I was fighting the ventilator and they pulled out the breathing tube and I said, thank you. And then there I was sitting on the bed looking each and every doctor, nurse, family, friend in the eye going, don't worry, all is well.
And what he experienced on the other side changed everything. He came back and wrote Proof of Heaven, which spent 97 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. This conversation goes where most won't, guys. His journey through death, what he found there, and what modern science is only beginning to understand about consciousness. This is the one that's going to stay with you. Enjoy.
3/4 of those life reviews stress that the review was from the perspective of everybody involved. So in other words, if you've been handing out pain and suffering to others, you get to feel what that felt like to them. You become them.
You know, I know you've got a few books out there, but this was your first one, Proof of Heaven. And I'm going to be pretty vulnerable with the audience right now and with you. My entire life, I have had an unwavering fear of death. And, you know, I know that's not necessarily an uncommon fear, but I have used it to drive almost every area of success in my life because my mortality reminds me of the time that I have left, and that every day that passes is a day I'll never get back. And so when I read your book, it really provided me a level of comfort that I hadn't felt before I read it. And so, you know, I wanted to bring you on the show because the experience that I had just by reading the words on these pages, I want to challenge that experience to what I can do for others by just having a conversation with you. So first and foremost, man, I really appreciate you coming on the show and talking with me and my audience.
Well, Josh, it's a real pleasure and honor to be here with you today. I greatly appreciate the invitation, and hopefully some of what I have to share will help your audience come to a richer understanding of, you know, why they're here and what this is all about.
Absolutely. So I know you've done this 1,000 times, and for those who don't know who you are, I'd love for you to kind of set the stage and give a little context to maybe the book, your experience, and essentially your journey.
Sure. Well, I think it's important to point out that I was raised in a very scientific family. Also important to point out I was adopted. That is a gigantic part of my story not to be missed because it has a tremendous amount to do with how everything unfolded into my telling of my events that I've been through. And important in my life was my adoptive father. He was a globally renowned neurosurgeon. He'd been a combat surgeon in the Second World War. He was in the Pacific Theater for more than 2 years. Saw a lot of, horrible things during the war. And yet when he came back to this world, he was relatively intact. And he came back and headed up a neurosurgical training program in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and became a global leader in the field. And I'll tell you, a big clue to his kind of success in coming out of all that unscathed was his belief in God. I still have at my bedside a little pocket Bible, New Testament and Psalms, that he had with him in the Pacific. And to me, it's a touchstone because it's very important to point out he had all this knowledge about physics, cosmology, neuroscience, neurosurgery, et cetera. And in the all that knowledge he completely knew in the reality of a loving personal God and power of prayer. It's something he'd grown up with. His own father had been a general surgeon who took him to the Presbyterian church every Sunday. So that's where all that came from. Now, for me, I grew up in the 60s and 70s. And like many of us from that generation, I knew science is the pathway to truth. And I even remember having this animated discussion with my sixth grade confirmation teacher in Methodist Church, where I was trying to teach her about Big Bang cosmology and tell her why it was much better than the story in Genesis. Anyway, that's kind of where I was coming from. But I made the same mistake that so many people in our world have made about kind of science and spirituality. Um, and that was, the assumption that Newtonian deterministic science leads you towards truth. And there's a great quote I love from Werner Heisenberg. He won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1932 for his work on the uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics. And he said, the first gulp from the glass of natural sciences will lead you towards atheism. But at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you. And what he meant is he knew from those early findings in the 1920s and 30s in quantum physics, where they were beginning to suspect that consciousness itself was something fundamental in the universe and not simply derived from physical matter in the brain and all that. And yet he didn't know exactly where, they didn't know where to go with all that. And yet there's a tremendous amount of knowledge that we've accrued in the scientific world since that time that help us to more fully understand that primacy of consciousness that's hinted at by quantum physics. And this is where we actually go in our third book, Living in a Mindful Universe. And in that book, we unite the science and spirituality very dramatically. But anyway, getting back to my story, that was kind of the background. And I went through much of my life wanting to believe in what my father believed, all the things I was told in church, but I wanted proof. I wanted scientific proof of the reality of all this. I wasn't going to simply accept things on blind faith. And so that's setting the stage. So in fact, in 2008, when my NDE happened in November, I was 54 years old, and in fact, thought I understood brain, mind, consciousness to some degree. I mean, I was teaching neurosurgery at Harvard Medical School, so I thought I understood some of that stuff. And then I had an absolutely life-changing, world-changing event. And that came in the form of a sudden, severe onset of bacterial meningoencephalitis. It was one of the worst kinds of meningitis you can have in terms of being deadly and destroying the brain and killing somebody. It was E. coli. And in fact, if you do a literature search, you'll find E. coli meningitis almost always happens in newborns. It's extremely rare beyond the age of 3 months. So my doctors had that little challenge: is how in the world did I acquire this thing? And the way it hit me was, 4:30 in the morning, waking up on November 10th, 2008, with horrific back pain, thinking I could walk down the hallway to the bath, to get into a hot bath and maybe relieve some of the pain. I almost couldn't get back out of the tub. And then it was baby steps, staggering back to the bed, collapsing, writhing in agony and a cold sweat. Soon thereafter, my youngest son, Bond, who was 10 years old at the time, came in, realized Dad wasn't off at work, and boy, he looks terrible. He started rubbing my head, and I, just screamed out in pain. And, that was about my last memory. I was then gone from this world, right there at home. There's a myth out there perpetrated by a kind of an attacked writer, not a journalist, but somebody wrote an article about me, and he was trying to kind of portray this picture that I was unreliable and just making everything up. So that kind of crazy story has nothing to do with what was really going on. And also that writer tried to make the claim that this was a medically induced coma, which couldn't be further from the truth. And it's the reason that it was a meningitis-induced coma. This is why the scientific world takes my story so seriously. And important to point out is not just the medical details I presented in the book Proof of Heaven, but medical details gathered by 3 doctors not involved in my care, but fascinated by my miraculous recovery. And they wrote a case report on my medical records. It came out in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, September 2018. And That case report by those three doctors made it very clear that my brain was in no shape whatsoever to harbor any kind of dream or hallucination, because the neocortex, the outer surface of the brain, that's where all those calculations happen that give us all the detailed elements of conscious awareness and of our ability to willfully influence that awareness. And my entire neocortex, according to MRI and CT scans and neurologic exams, was involved. In fact, my brainstem was badly damaged on day one. This was a horrific case of bacterial meningitis. And in fact, so first of all, the point of the case report is that brain was in no shape to harbor any kind of phenomenal experience, dream, hallucination, and much less this extraordinary set of visions I had. And that was what haunted me early on. The more I investigated this, as my memories were coming back, my knowledge was coming back, it just didn't line up. There was no way to have had this experience if the tenets of modern neuroscience about the role of the neocortex were true. And so, therefore, my very awareness, and I'm going to describe in a minute here what that awareness consisted of, was a violation of materialist science and its assumption that the physical brain creates consciousness. No, it does not. There's something much deeper and richer going on. So, at any rate, getting into my NDE itself, November 10th, 2008, I went into coma at home. And then my family saw me having seizures in bed. They called the 911. The ambulance came. They had trouble breaking the seizures. They took me to Lynchburg General Hospital, where I had worked as a neurosurgeon for about 2 years. And that's where Dr. Laura Potter, my ER doctor, did a lumbar puncture and realized when it was thick white pus under pressure coming out of my cerebrospinal fluid that I was in deep trouble. And she knew that because she knew I'd gone into coma within 3.5 hours of symptom onset. And not only that, I was in a deep coma at that time. And she was very worried I wasn't going to survive at all. In fact, at the beginning of the week, they gave me a 10% chance of survival. But by the end of the week, 7 days in coma on 3 powerful antibiotics on a ventilator the whole time without showing any signs of neurologic improvement, that's when it was time to let me go. And the doctors held a conference that Sunday morning, day 7 of coma, where they said it was time to take me off the ventilator, stop the antibiotics, and just let me die. And that's when I started coming back to this world. But when I started waking up, my brain was still horribly damaged. Now, what I need to tell you is what I knew in that moment when I woke up was I remember the journey I had just been on. In fact, I had no memories of Eben Alexander's life. That's a very important part of my NDE, and it's very atypical. I've never heard of that degree of amnesia with a near-death experience. And of course, early on, my thinking was, and this is before a lot of my neurosurgical knowledge had come back to me, my thinking was, well, I guess if you have meningitis and it wrecks the neocortex, that would wreck memories. But what I didn't realize yet was all the memories are going to come back to me. Because as we point out in the book, Living in a Mindful Universe, memories are not stored in the brain. And that's one of the biggest nails in the coffin of materialist neuroscience. You don't hear it discussed much, but neurosurgeons have suspected that, for decades because of all the millions of brain operations we've done, and never has long-term memory been removed. But in my case, I was amnesic, and I think that was an important part of many of the lessons I was to learn. So in my journey in this amnesic state, it all started in what I call the earthworm's eye view, a very primitive course on responsive realm, like being in dirty jello or underground. Like there were roots or blood vessels all around me. And even though it sounds foreboding when I describe that, given that I had amnesia and no memory of anything else, I just accepted it. This is the way things are. It wasn't as disturbing as it might sound when I describe it. But the good news is it didn't last forever, that subterranean, what I call the earthworm eye view level of my journey. And there came this slowly spinning white light surrounded by silvery and golden tendrils. And as it came towards me, it opened like a rip in the fabric of this ugly earthworm eye view and led up into this brilliant, ultra-real gateway valley. And that's where things really got kind of indescribably unusual and, oh my God, what's going on here? And in that valley, it's kind of like Plato's world of ideals, but for the individual soul. This is where we reunite the souls of departed loved ones, go through life reviews, plan next incarnations, all those kind of big big items, and we'll get into more of that later in terms of the next life business. Um, but in that setting, it was just absolutely amazing. It was a world of perfection in many ways. So I had no body awareness. I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. There were millions of other butterflies looping and spiraling in these vast formations, colors beyond the rainbow. I mean, rivers of pure beauty. And then below us, this meadow, verdant, green, fertile, surrounded by a forest and sparkling uh, waterfalls into crystal blue pools, incredible beauty. And in this meadow were thousands of beings dancing. Lots of joy, merriment, children playing, dogs jumping, incredible festivities, all of it being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs of angelic choirs. They were pure ovals of energy, but they seemed to have a spiritual kind of an angelic essence to them. And they would emanate, there would be chants, anthems, hymns, thundering through me, just incredible awe and majesty, just beauty beyond description. But also this deep sense of, I remember spiritual home. This is like you're coming home again. And it's amazing how many people wrote me to say exactly that, that they read Proof of Heaven or heard me talk, and it reminded them of something very deep, often forgotten already, but deep about their own soul experience. So this was a very rich kind of resonance when I described all this with other people who, seemed to have similar experiences in their memory, and that's why they would reach out and contact me. In fact, that's what the second book is all about. The Map of Heaven is all about the many people who contacted and how common these experiences are. So, at any rate, in this beautiful Gateway Valley, a world of perfection, incredible beauty, where I'm simply a speck of awareness on this butterfly wing, best part about it was I wasn't alone. There was a beautiful young woman beside me on the butterfly wing. She had sparkling blue eyes, high forehead, high cheekbones, broad smile, soft brown hair framing her lovely face. She was dressed in the same kind of simple yet very colorful garb as all of those people dancing down in the meadow below us. And she looked at me with this look of pure love. She never said a word. She didn't have to. Her thoughts, her mind melded with mine. And this message was so reassuring and validating and refreshing. The message, as I converted into words weeks later when I wrote all this down, because when the message came to me, it was this pure conceptual, emotional knowing. And that knowing was, you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You're richly cared for. And you can do no harm. Now, do nothing wrong. That's the way it was put. Now, I wish I'd explained that last phrase a lot better in Proof of Heaven, because some people took it the wrong way. And they didn't realize that when you're in that realm with that beauty and that light and that love, that anything you might have done in your life review that would be, greedy, selfish, kind of embarrassing, giving out pain or suffering to others, looks especially bad. So, in that sense, what I meant by you can do no wrong is in that light, you can see that the path of love, light, connection, kindness, compassion, mercy, forgiveness, that's the pathway that's the most straightforward pathway as a soul towards this achieving this oneness with the universe and this purpose that we came here for. But we have the free will to do otherwise. We can act other ways. But this is why it's so important to understand why being a hardcore materialist and then getting to your deathbed and having your loved ones show up and you realize it's not just your imagination or wishful thinking, but they're really there because their souls are still connected to you and still alive. And then you realize you wasted your whole life as a materialist focusing on the wrong things. This is all about acknowledging at this stage in our life that we are souls with, responsibility, with an ability to make this world a much better place for all of our fellow beings, and to move beyond our little ego focus into a much richer focus on the higher good and taking care of others. That was kind of the bigger message. So, at any rate, this beautiful girl on the butterfly wing was extremely refreshing, and what a gift! And it was from that point on, I remember this soft summer breeze that blew through, and that was my first awareness of that God force, whatever you want to call it. And I came back from my journey realizing that force, which, for near-death experiencers, no matter what their prior religious beliefs, many of whom were prior atheists or agnostics, more than 90% of near-death experiencers come back to this world knowing in the reality of an intelligent, personal, loving force at the core of the universe. Now, it doesn't matter if you want to try and call that God, Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit, Tao, all the many words humans have attached to their kind of experience of that oneness with this infinitely loving creative force. So for me, it was an incredible gift to have that touchstone of that beautiful love, and that's what the soft summer breeze first introduced me to. But there was much more ready to unfold. And what I remember then is I could sense that all of four-dimensional space-time, which I could vaguely sense the material world from that realm, because that realm is timeless. It's spiritual. That's why you can have a life review, birth to death, and everything in between. And in fact, 33% of the people who have life reviews say their entire life is involved. And you might wonder, how can that happen during a 10-minute cardiac arrest? Well, it can happen because in that realm, you're truly timeless. And reliving your entire life is a possibility. But it doesn't have to take up the earth time that we normally think it would. That's the important thing. So at any rate, in this beautiful journey, all of that was collapsing down, including that spiritual realm and its associated deep time with a whole different ordering of causality. It's one of the reasons NDEs are so hard to explain. They're called ineffable or beyond our language, because when you visualize birth, death, everything in between, all these things make so much more sense when you see them all at once. And it can include memories from past lives and even potential events for future lives. So just this very rich kind of theater of unfolding that becomes apparent to us in these journeys. But we also realize we have a responsibility. That this is not just that we can act any way we can and our ego run the show out of control, because, it's ultimately about the higher good and about helping others. And that's where our soul finds the most ready pathway forward. Now, in this event, what I'm now witnessing is those angelic choirs have provided yet another musical portal. And I remember seeing all of that Gateway Valley realm collapsing down as I ascended through another light portal. And this time it was into an absolute a dazzling darkness, as I call it. It was a resolution of all dualities, a place I call the core. And the core for me was as far as I went on this journey. You often hear near-death experiences talk about a boundary, a wall. And if you go beyond that, you're not coming back. And I think I was able to glimpse beyond the boundary in this vision of the core. But for me, the core was a complete resolution of all the dualities of our existence. We have masculine, feminine, good, evil, dark, light, all the many kind of gradations of things in our lives. And yet in that core realm, everything resolves into pure oneness. And the most interesting thing to me was when you get to that level, there is not a battle between good and evil. It's not as if that force, that God force, has an opposing force of darkness. The darkness is only something that emerges way out there in the periphery when you get very close to this material world. And it emerges for various reasons. I explained that a bit in Proof of Heaven, how it provides a gradient that allows us to have this gift of free will and to then learn from our choices and learn that, the higher good is the best pathway to pursue. So at any rate, in that core realm, I also recognize that my very conscious awareness was directly sourced in that God mind. And that's a very important point. So none of us are ever distant from that sense of that loving co-creative force at the core of the universe. It can be there in prayer and meditation. This is why a lot of the focus of our third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is all about meditation, especially using differential frequency brainwave entrainment, where you get an oscillation in the lower brainstem that can be very powerful at liberating a transcendental amount of conscious awareness. So at any rate, meditation is a key, and I've used meditation, every day for the last 12, 13 years to return to my NDE, to cultivate relationships with that, with the entities I find there. In fact, in the book, Living in a Mindful Universe, I describe where I used such a meditation about 2.5 years after my coma to finally encounter the soul of my father, my adoptive father, who had passed over 4 years before my coma. But interestingly, he was not the one there. If I had scripted it, he would have been there front and center as my spiritual guide. And yet I had this woman that I didn't know. At least I didn't have a direct memory of who she was in my physical lifetime. And that, of course, all comes together 4 months after the coma, as told in the book Proof of Heaven, when I discover the identity of that beautiful angel on the butterfly wing. And it turns out it links up very tightly with my birth family history and with a birth sister. I won't go into more detail about that right now, but the bottom line is I would cycle through all these levels multiple times, always passing, by remembering the musical notes of the melody. That was the key, is that music, what we remember is music. And of course, I hope your listeners acknowledge that music in those realms is not limited by the physics of sound and eardrums and our auditory system, but that it's a pure music. It's I think that's the source of where the greatest composers and musicians have gotten their best stuff, is in this kind of ideal world. They have a way of getting in there and harvesting that, but it doesn't mean you can fully duplicate the beautiful music that I heard and that was part of the melodies that gave me these light portals between spiritual levels. At any rate, I would go through these levels multiple times. Every time I entered the core, told the same thing: you're not here to stay, you'll be going back. We'll teach you many things. Um, and one of those lessons in particular I'll mention now because it's very important, something that took me 3 or 4 years to even figure out. And it had to do with some visions I had in the core. Um, and they were of reincarnation and of life reviews, very strongly written. And because of my amnesia, I could not have an Eben Alexander life review because I didn't have the knowledge, the memory of those facts. That was a very important, and that all was for a reason. It took me years to realize all this, but it was to make a point about memory and consciousness. There was a tremendous amount I still had to learn. At any rate, there came a time when I could no longer conjure up the musical melody to come up out of the earthworm eye view into that gateway valley. Uh, as they told me, I wasn't there to stay. I'd be going back. And I thought going back was back to the earthworm eye view because that had happened several times. But now I realized something more was going on. And I had to go back to some deeper level that I didn't remember. And that's when I saw thousands of beings going off around me into the distance, heads bowed, many holding candles, and they were praying. There was this murmuring energy coming to me. And when I came back to the world and wrote it all up weeks later, I said that was the energy of prayer. And that's what I could feel kind of bringing me back in this direction. And the final thing I saw were 6 faces that bubbled up out of the muck. They'd say a few words and then disappear. I can remember them as clearly today as if the whole thing happened yesterday. And yet it happened, more than 17 years ago. And the interesting thing is that they served as what are called veridical time anchors because 5 of those 6 faces were people who were there the last 24 to 48 hours of coma at my bedside in the ICU. And I don't remember many other family and friends who were there earlier in the week. So to me, that was a very strong indicator that they were pointing to me that the vast majority of my spiritual journey had to happen between days 1 and 4 or 1 and 5 of my 7-day coma. And that's very important because the case report makes it clear that my brain was in its worst shape during that time. So least capable of, mustering any kind of consciousness generated by the brain. But if the brain is not the creator of consciousness, but just a filter or reducing valve, then this is just the process of going across that filter and becoming much more in touch with that primordial mind and with one's life and soul purpose and these kind of big items. And that's why meditation and centering prayer are so important because anybody can get to the same level that I've gotten to with my NDE with sufficient focus on prayer and meditation. And for me, going within is an extremely powerful tool once you realize that your mind is not simply your mind, but in fact, we're sharing the mind of the universe. And so we have a mental connection with our fellow beings. We have a mental connection with that God force and the creative power in the universe. And that's where meditation and centering prayer can be so handy. But never forget that the actual living, everything we do as souls, is accomplished here in this world, in this kind of ignorance of not being aware of everything our higher soul knows from between lives and afterlife and all that, prior lives. But realizing that we're really all in this together. We're interconnected, and as near-death experiences will tell you, it's all about that binding force of love. That's what brings so much healing and wholeness to this world. So there on day 7 of coma, that's when the doctors held the conference saying it was time to let me go. And it was a few hours later when I was fighting the ventilator and they pulled out the breathing tube and I said, thank you. And I know my youngest sister Phyllis got up there about 30 minutes after they extubated me. And she told me it was the wildest thing. As she was walking down the hall, she could see the other sister, Betsy, was crying. And so Phyllis thought maybe I had gotten worse, maybe I died. And as she got into the room, I'm sitting up on the bed. And she said the whole family had spent that whole week worrying that I was going to die. And then there I was sitting on the bed, looking each and every doctor, nurse, family, friend in the eye, going, don't worry, all is well. Don't worry, all is well. And so I'm making that point to them with such great confidence. And she was wondering where in the world that came from. And this is where it came from. I'd had this extraordinary vision. And it happened in a way that my brain could not have been generating it. And there's a lot more we can say about all of that, about the science, especially as we cover it in the book Living in a Mindful Universe, uniting the quantum physics, the neuroscience, philosophy of mind, bringing it all together into a picture which basically is one of mind as being primary and the entire physical universe as emergent from mind. And certainly, if we believe we have free will, this is an example of how we have tremendous free will to influence our emerging reality. It took me 2 months after waking up from coma for all of my memories to come back. One of the most amazing things about it, as we discuss in Living in a Mindful Universe, is because of deep, detailed conversations with family and friends about early childhood events. I realized that my memories were more complete after that 2-month recovery phase than they had been before the coma. And that in itself is a big shocker, but it's just emphasizing memories are not stored in the brain. So we have the brain is a filter, a reducing valve, a transceiver that allows access to all that information. But ultimately, it's consciousness and memory are not living in the brain itself.
Thank you so much for taking us through in such detail, that story. I think that really helps me and my audience to kind of live it with you, right? And visualize it the best that we possibly can. After hearing it, even the word visualize just seems to minimize that situation, but it really helps us to feel what you felt. I have a million questions that we wouldn't get to if this was a 12-hour interview, but I'm going to try to arc this a little bit for the context of the show. So I don't want to pry too much on, some of the last things that you said just yet. So I have a couple specific questions relating to before, and then we'll kind of get into and then maybe after. Hopefully we have enough time to get through it. But thank you for going through that in such detail. Mm-hmm. So most of us, Eben, can I call you Eben or do you like
Sure.
Dr. Alexander?
Eben's fine.
Okay. Eben, most of us build our identity around what we know, what we're good at, and what the world rewards. Before this incident, before your NDE, how would you have described reality? And how confident were you that you understood it at that time?
Well, before my coma, I would say, especially during those 15 years I was teaching neurosurgery at Harvard Medical School, I was more and more confounded by my assumption that somehow there was an afterlife and that consciousness could survive the death of the brain. During that time, it became increasingly difficult for me to explain that, given everything I was studying about the brain and mind and consciousness and neurons and neuronal networks and neuroscience, philosophy of mind. Where was that consciousness going to come from if the brain weren't there to generate it? But I didn't realize yet, for example, all the evidence for non-local consciousness, telepathy. Many of us will say, oh, yeah, we have a telepathic connection or something like that, but we might not necessarily believe it's real. We might joke about it. And yet telepathy is something that's been proven very demonstrably, especially with the Gansfeld experiments at Maimonides a research center in New York, where they did dream telepathy and they were able to project, mental patterns from one person to another in a dream state. So, very reliably. In fact, that experiment's been done many times, many centers, proven beyond the shadow of a doubt. There's also this beautiful book that I love called Twin Telepathy by Guy Leon Playfair. And that book, he basically makes the point through his scientific research that 35% of identical twins have very powerful telepathic experiences. And so once you realize our mind is not really our own, but that we share mind, that's a very important first step to kind of getting into exploration of mind and acknowledging that your mind is sharing the mind of the universe. And that means sharing mind with all other sentient beings.
Intently.
Yeah, so it's really all about coming to a deeper understanding of what mind is, telepathy. That we have this interconnection. Of course, when people go through a near-death experience, they can have this tremendous expansion of their mental connections to where they'll connect with people, say loved ones who might be all around the world. They could be thousands of miles away, and yet it's very common to hear a story of what's called a shared death experience. Shared death are like near death experiences in many ways. There are a few subtle differences. But the main thing about shared death experiences, they usually happen either to a healthcare worker, but more commonly to a loved one. But the loved one can be 1,000 or 10,000 miles away. Distance is not a problem with these kind of communications. And it's because the mental field is connection through that quantum entanglement. It's an instantaneous field of connection. It's not something that travels and is limited by, say, electromagnetic signaling. Because those have a diminution with an inverse square law, things like that. But this is instantaneous and is not diminished with distance. And I think it's strongly linked to that entanglement field of quantum physics that won the Nobel Prize in 2022 for 3 investigators who were studying it. And they did the work that basically proved that quantum entanglement, spooky action at a distance, the thing Einstein hated about quantum physics, was absolutely true and right at the core of our reality. Einstein was wrong. Niels Bohr was right. Schrodinger and others. I mean, this notion of the primacy of mind is something that's really undeniable when you kind of get into the deep science of quantum physics and combine it with neuroscience, et cetera. And the reason quantum physics is important in consciousness is because everything going on in this brain is, in terms of neurons firing, not firing, network activity, et cetera, is due to quantum effects. Every single bit of it. There's not, it's ions and ion channels and neurotransmitters and synaptic vesicles. These are all molecules and atoms, ions, things that are absolutely at quantum levels of activity. They're not Newtonian deterministic billiard balls. And this is where mind over matter is important, because there's a top-down causality inherent in this kind of notion of mind that allows us to come to a deeper understanding. But it's that kind of God mind working through our minds, with each brain serving as basically a dissociation mechanism that twists off a little eddy current of that primary mind that we treat as our mind. And yet ultimately we can traverse back across that veil and come in connection with a much grander aspect of mind. And that's where meditation and centering prayer are so absolutely important.
How much of this did you believe before the NDE?
I had pretty much come to a conclusion that the brain was the creator of consciousness. I didn't have this other knowledge per se, about telepathy and these spiritual journeys that are very real and powerful when you study them in big numbers. And also, I had no notion about the scientific evidence for reincarnation. I know I've mentioned that. I'd never heard of that literature before, but after my coma, as for many NDEers, they come back realizing that, one physical incarnation makes no sense. That to actually do the kind of growth you have to do to grow full spiritually in this universe, you need more than one physical incarnation. And that's exactly what happens. But the data for that was being accumulated about 60 miles from where I lived, up at University of Virginia. And ever since the late 1960s, they've been studying cases of past life memories in children suggestive of reincarnation under Ian Stevenson and more recently Jim Tucker. And basically, in 2,500 cases of past life memory claims that they investigated, they solved more than 1,700. That is, they actually found, doing scientific research, that the person described by the child, mode of death, names, relatives, villages, et cetera, um, was was real. And so, most of us, our kids might talk about past life memories and we pat them on the back, and yeah, that's very cute. If you're really smart, you'll be open minded and just ask the kid to give you more information, but don't give them anything leading. In fact, there was a recent paper out of UVA that looked prospectively, at kids in our modern society, what percentage of kids have these strong claims of past life memories, and that number is 7% in North America. So that's a lot of children having past life memories. And you can imagine there probably are other cases where the family and the parents are suppressing it. And so they're not about to say, yes, our child has had those memories. But in a recent open survey from UVA, they said that 7% of kids claim to have these memories. And then, of course, when you do the scientific work and research and you find that the kid is right, and there's no other way they could have come to that knowledge other than that it's been reincarnated into their body, then you go, okay. And there is something called program forgetting. That's a very important thing to point out. As Jim Tucker and Ian Stevenson will tell you, you must harvest these memories from these children before age 6 or 7, because after that, their natural process is to cover them over. So even the kids who have been most heavily written about, by the time they're 9 or 10, they have no memory left of that past life. It's gone. And that's why most of us say, well, I don't believe in reincarnation because I don't remember it. Yeah, well, guess what? You can recover past lives through meditation, centering prayer, hypnotic regression, having an NDE or other profound kind of physiologic shock to your system. All these are ways of uncovering those memories of past lives that reveal we come back again and again, all in this process of grace, growth, transformation, and the evolution of consciousness itself. So when I talk about reincarnation, it's not the kind of Buddhist interpretation where it's a wheel of suffering that you're trying to get off of. But in fact, this is more grace filled towards growth and the higher good. It's a much more kind of optimistic view of reincarnation and why it exists and what we're here to do. So,
Eben, sometimes the thing that humbles us isn't failure, it's actually survival. I'm curious, very curious from you. After you woke up, what was harder for you to reconcile? The experience that you had or what you used to believe?
well, I'll tell you, the experience was so powerful, and yet it was so confusing. I was literally on this up and down kind of seesaw in the months after my coma. One of the biggest shocks to me is I'd never paid any attention to the near-death experience literature before, because I thought it was just a dying brain playing tricks. So what? Who cares? That would be a typical materialist response. Um, and so after this, I realized there was so much more to this kind of spiritual realm. And not only that, I was beginning, as started talking to my doctors, going through my medical records, the neurologic exams, all those scans, I realized, wait a minute, that brain was not in any shape to harbor a dream or hallucination. Um, so, how did this all happen? It was a big mystery to me, and it was very kind of conflicting because I keep defaulting to my old views, and yet they failed miserably at explaining all this. And yet, I was trying to connect the dots on the other side to make better sense of it, from a scientific perspective. And so it was really tough. And the other thing I'll add is that I'd never read the NDE literature before. I knew it existed out there, but again, I thought no reason to pay it any mind. Um, and then had this, what happened was I met back with my son, who had been there, my oldest son, majoring in neuroscience in college at the time. He had been there during the coma, but then he went back to school after I started waking up, and then he came home after he finished his exams. It was the day before Thanksgiving, 2 days after I got out of the hospital in 2008. And I remember I gave him a big hug when he got home. He came at 6 in the morning because he'd heard I stayed up all night because I was so energized by the experience. And so anyway, big hug when he got to the door. And I remember telling him it was way too real to be real, because I tried to share it with my doctors, and they said, well, your brain was soaking in pus. We have no idea how you're even coming back to us, but you can forget about it because a dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. So that was my doctor's viewpoint. That's why I told my son, I said, well, I guess it had to be hallucination. That's what my doctors told me, but wow, way too real to be real. That was kind of the words I used. And he told me, well, Dad, if you really want this to make sense, you must write down everything you can remember about your experience before you read anybody else's NDE. So the best advice I've ever gotten. I took 6 weeks, wrote down about 20,000 words. That was my database of my experience. And during it all, I was very perplexed, but then I started reading the NDE literature after that. And that's where I really started hitting a big wall, because I realized that guardian angel on the butterfly wing, if I had scripted all this, it would have been my adoptive father. He passed over 4 years before my coma, and yet he was nowhere to be found in this journey. And who in the world was that beautiful woman? Because the other thing I learned in reading many accounts was that spiritual guide was usually somebody pretty important to you in your life. And of course, those who've read Proof of Heaven, they have a bit of an answer, because they realized 4 months after my coma, I got a picture in the mail of that birth sister. And that's when I went, oh my God. I mean, initially when I saw the picture, I was just shocked, put it up on my dresser, crying, just this horrible tragedy of losing this beautiful sister. And it was really the next morning when I was sitting there in the same room reading a book by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross on life after death. And on page 28 of that book, she has a story of a girl who goes into deep coma, very ill, almost dies. She's welcomed to heaven by her brother, comes back to this world, and she's talking over with her father and says, but I don't understand. I don't have a brother. And the father says, well, you did, but he died 3 months before you were born. So we never told you about it. And that's when I looked up at that picture on my dresser and went, oh my God. And collapsed to the floor, heart pounding. All of a sudden, all the worlds united. That earthly world, that rainy Tuesday morning where I was reading this book, and all of a sudden, oh my God, that recognition of that beautiful guardian angel. In fact, in her picture, it's like she's looking at me as if to say, do you finally get it? And yes, Betsy, I finally get it and am getting it.
I mean, if consciousness isn't produced in the brain, a lot of our systems need rethinking. I'm curious, where is consciousness produced, and what's the most misunderstood part about your work with this regard?
Okay, well, I think what we're talking about here is, what are we accessing? And I would say we're accessing an information field. And that same field is shown to us in very grand form in the life review. In fact, if you, I know Bruce Grayson wrote a paper on life reviews. It came out in the Journal of Near-Death Studies back in 2021, in the autumn of 2021. And sorry, I'm just getting one thing here. But the interesting thing about life reviews, and in his article, he's reviewing almost 700 life reviews and more than 1,000 NDE cases. And in the life review, as I said earlier, 37% involve their entire life. Nothing is omitted. About half of them said it was a reliving of events, not just remembering. It's as if the events were still ongoing. That's very important, because I think when I talk about this information field, that's the information field you have access to when you die, that life review. And the other interesting things about life reviews from his scientific study, 3/4 of those life reviews stress that the review was from the perspective of everybody involved. So in other words, if you've been handing out pain and suffering to others, have been greedy and selfish, in the life review, you get to feel what that felt like to them. You become them. This is why the life review, in so many ways, is the golden rule: treat others as you would like to be treated, written into the fabric of the universe. So that's a very complex information field. And the last point that Bruce makes in that article is that 84% of those cases said that the events of the life review were more real than lived experience memories. And that's been confirmed by other investigators, et cetera. But just in looking at that kind of data set of life reviews and what is commonly available to us, because about half of NDEs involve a life review. So you start getting this incredible picture of this information field where you even revisit all these events and relive them as if they're still ongoing. In other words, it shows you the universe is paying big attention. And the focus here is on how we as sentient beings behave, act, think, and treat each other and interact with each other. That's where the focus is. And ultimately, what NDEers will tell you is that the more we can manifest love, compassion, kindness, mercy, acceptance, when necessary, forgiveness with our fellow beings and with ourselves, forgive ourselves too. The more we can open up into these kind of higher souls that we truly are. And this is why, to me, that information field and seeing the brain as kind of an access point or transceiver that allows us to interact with that information field. But ultimately, we find that field and what it allows us to do and see are far grander than we would ever think from our very limited materialist positions in these bodies in this physical realm.
Hmm. So I'm just processing all of this. It's really great to hear this directly from you. It's got a different impact than reading words on a page. So I'm just
That's why I love sharing it. I mean, I've done hundreds of podcasts, and I love getting it out there because this is a message important for really every soul on this world can benefit from it. And also we can all contribute then to the higher good and to helping each other and to promote this golden rule that's written into the fabric of the universe through life reviews. And we can all bring that kind of love and compassion and kindness to the world at large.
Yeah. One thing that's coming to me that I wanted to ask is, so I've noticed many high performers are driven by control and certainty and even fear of loss. What does your experience suggest about the cost of over-identifying with this control?
Well, I think that what you find is from the NDEs and this kind of story and this whole kind of dialogue is all about the higher good. It's all very simply about helping others, making the world a better place. And so, for example, for corporate leaders and people who have kind of high-end control of companies and of groups of people and of processes and of services and of products, when those people, when the heads of these big organizations start having this higher sense of bringing good to the world, of a higher good, of contributing and making the world a better place, making the lives of billions of unborn humans a much better life than it might have been. To me, that is a big driver to do the right thing. And you find, I would say, that corporate success, the bottom line, the profit margin, et cetera, will all be very satisfying if you're first and foremost directing your attention to helping people, to really delivering those products and services in ways that really make this world a much better place. And when you push hard on that, on your contributing to the world through kind of love and kindness and compassion, that ultimately is what brings you the best rewards. I would say focusing on the profit margin and on the bottom line, on the dollar amount, is wrong because it can lead you away from that focus on the higher good and on making the world a better place and just envisioning your consumers, as fellow beings who you're actually helping to have better lives. So let's do that, and let's get rid of this kind of egomaniacal narcissism that seems to be so rampant in our modern world, because that's a recipe for kind of a bleak life review, I promise you, to be that focused on greed and selfishness and profit, as opposed to making other people's lives better. And your own life will improve.
In your opinion, how hard or how difficult is it for somebody to reconcile this realization without having gone through it, the NDE, I mean?
I think a lot of people have a natural feeling that, they're here to help other people. They enjoy the effect of the kind of interaction of helping somebody do something or achieve something. And to me, it's kind of a natural human quality. It's kind of sad what I've seen in our modern era with politicization and polarization, and this whole thing of you know absolutely the extreme versus the extreme, as opposed to realizing most of the real helpful answers lie more in the middle. And I think that's where most people would lie: is let's try and get along and make this world a better place for all of us. And if we're trying to make other people's lives miserable, ultimately that's going to reflect back on us, because the universe in many ways is this beautiful mirror. And the more we serve as a conduit for love, compassion, kindness, and mercy, and bring it to this world, the more the world seems to reflect that back to us. And that's simply what I've found in the 17 years since my coma. And there were certainly people who tried to shoot me down, people who tried to discredit me, to defame me, because for some reason they found this message threatening. But ultimately, I realize people are always doing the best they can with what they know in the time at the time, and there's still a lot of ignorance around. So this is about trying to bring people up to a higher level of who they are, move away from that little ego mind. I love how Michael Singer, in his book *The Untethered Soul*, he calls that voice in your head your annoying roommate. Yep, that's about it. So meditation, centering, prayer for me are ways of letting Eben Alexander's little annoying roommate state a request, ask a question, make a comment, but then that ego voice of Eben Alexander goes into timeout. And I've learned to ride the tones of sacred acoustics. That's the form of differential frequency brainwave entrainment I use. People can go to sacredacoustics.com to learn a lot more. A full disclosure is that Sacred Acoustics was co-founded by my wife, by the co-author of the book Living in a Mindful Universe. Her name is Karen Newell, but she's an extremely adept meditator, and she's very knowledgeable about the use of differential frequency brainwave entrainment to enhance a conscious state. So if you go to sacredacoustics.com, you can learn a lot more. I'll also point out that Dr. Anna Newsom, a psychiatrist in New York, did a pilot study with Sacred Acoustics, especially with a file called the Whole Mind Bundle. And that study was published in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases as a pilot study of this meditation technique. And she was looking at an endpoint of anxiety and using a state trait anxiety inventory. And with that, she found that over 2 weeks of listening to Sacred Acoustics, her patients had a 26% reduction in anxiety symptoms. Compared to the control group, 2 weeks of psychotherapy got only a 7% reduction in symptoms. So threefold improvement in reduction of anxiety symptoms just by listening to the tones. And I promise you, there's a lot more going on there than just relief of anxiety. And I know in our workshops, for example, our meditation workshops, we've had many people come in connection with their souls of departed loved ones, with spiritual guides, with wisdom, with this sense of that God force at the core of the universe. So sacredacoustics.com is a very proven, powerful tool to actually use this kind of technique of oscillations from the lower brainstem to set conscious awareness free. And if you give it a try, that I'll also point out that Whole Mind Bundle on sacredacoustics.com. This publication by Anna Newsom came out in, I think it was January of 2020. So it's right at the beginning of the pandemic. We realized pandemic was going to create tons of anxiety and hardship. And so Karen dropped the price of that Whole Mind Bundle on the website to $19 and also put in a free button, because she realized with the economic collapse of the pandemic, a lot of people wouldn't have any money to put into meditation. So she wanted a free option so that people would have access to it anyway. And it's still available for free. We hope that people who have the money will pay for it, but ultimately we just want to share it with the world, get it out there, because we see this as a beautiful way to make the world a much better place for all of us.
That's excellent. I'll definitely link that in the show notes as well. I'm a big advocate of meditation, and it's done wonders for me personally. So we've got about 10 minutes left. I got two more questions for
All
you
right.
for now. I'm so curious. After everything that you've seen, you've felt, you've studied, what is it, Eben, that you believe now that most of us are here to unlearn?
Well, I think what we need to unlearn is that little ego mind and its little kind of traps about how you need to protect yourself and be kind of narcissistic and sociopathic. That's essentially what the unbridled ego will push you towards. And so this is really just and also, in our modern cultures, we've said the polarization, the political problems, it's all manufactured in many ways. And this is about kind of relaxing into a deeper truth that resonates with a lot of people, and that is that we're really here to help each other and that human beings are generally kind and caring. That golden rule is something that pretty much lives to some level in most of us, certainly not in the most hardcore narcissists. But it's really about achieving that sense of oneness and connection, which I think is our much more natural state.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that statement. All right, last question for you. So I'm very curious. You've been on hundreds of podcasts. You've done a ton of interviews. What is one question, Eben, that you wish people would ask you more? And then how would you answer it?
I think probably, I think we'd cut to the chase most quickly if they could ask me much more about what I think about reincarnation and how it works and why it's there. I think that's because to me, the near death experiences, shared death experiences, all these discussions of philosophy of mind and the hard problem of consciousness. My dogs are trying to chip in here. I don't know if you hear
It's all right.
them.
It's all right.
But anyway, it's really all about coming to that deeper understanding of who we are and why we're here. And it's not this egocentric focus of, trying to get the most toys you can before you die, but it's much more acknowledging the eternity of soul and our soul lines and that our lives are interwoven. In fact, the vision where I saw that in my core journey was one where I call it Indra's net. It's this interwoven fabric, and it shows this beautiful fabric of interwoven threads. There are lifetimes, multiple lifetimes, woven together, leading towards this golden center, which I would say is like Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's uh, vision of, as he wrote in the book, Phenomenon of Man in the mid 20th century. And he was a French Jesuit priest, so he had a spiritual basis. He was also a paleontologist. So he was a scientist who worked with billion-year timescales. And he was the one who, in the middle of the 20th century, when all these discussions about Darwinian evolution were occurring, he said, yes, there's evolution, but it's much grander than just, biological systems on Earth. He saw that all of consciousness throughout the cosmos was evolving. And that's what I think this is all leading towards. That's what I saw as that golden center in my NDE vision in the core was of this Christ consciousness that we're all heading for. And that's not something that's limited to any kind of Christianity, but it's more of what Pierre Teilhard de Chardin saw is this kind of universal God force. So that's where I think the scientific world is headed, is to a resolution of all these observations that unite science and spirituality and really bring us together and in a way that's much more optimistic and promising for the future of humanity because it shares our commonality and that binding force of love that contributes tremendously to a sense of wholeness and healing in us as individuals and in the world at large.
Dr. Eben Alexander, thank you. Where can people find your work, your book, and anything else that could help them?
Well, I would start at ebenalexander.com. That's EBEN Alexander.com. There's a tremendous amount of information there. The FAQ page, very important. Also, the recommended reading list. I've got lots of scientific papers, some with hot links right to the paper, books, etc. So, and that reading list is categorized. So it depends on what you're looking for. You'll find the category there, and then you can find plenty of information. There are many interviews, podcasts, etc. at ebenalexander.com. And probably most importantly, there's a 33-day journey into the heart of consciousness. That you click on it, it's on the welcome page. 33-day journey. Leave your first name and an email address. It's all totally free. You'll be off and running through a 33-day email drip campaign where each day you'll get a major topic from the book Living in a Mindful Universe presented to you. And more than 15,000 people have taken this course to date. They leave their comments and help each other. So all that information is there on each page, each day of this journey. That 33-day journey also includes 4 sacred acoustics tone files, so you can get started with a meditation, lots of clues about meditation. It's a real complete package to get all the scientific kind of understanding and the personal tools in the form of meditative techniques to put to use. So 33-day journey at ebenalexander.com. Also go to sacredacoustics.com. There's plenty of information there, a lot to help everybody who wants to meditate in many, many different ways. So sacredacoustics.com. Karen is also extremely responsive to her customers. So anybody who reaches out to her through Sacred Acoustics will get rapid and powerful, valuable feedback. There's also innersanctumcenter.com. That's INNER, sanctumcenter.com. That's a website that has multiple options. You have to check it out to see. But one draw card that's very important there, more than 50 interviews we did with thought leaders around the world during the pandemic on consciousness, on all of this, quantum physics, getting to the depths of it. InnerSanctumCenter.com is a repository for that. There's also a wonderful professional course at InnerSanctumCenter.com, and that one is with Dr. Anna Yusum and myself and Karen teaching professionals. That does have a cost with it. And then also there's a monthly group of our followers there at innersanctumcenter.com. These are all resources that'll get you going quickly into this whole revolution of human thought.
Great. Well, Eben, thank you so much for joining me on the show and for helping my listeners understand your journey and how that integrated into your life so they can hopefully take a little bit away from that, integrate into their own.
Well, thanks so much, Josh. Great to talk with you. And if you're so inclined, maybe we could have another discussion in a few months after you get a little feedback about all this, because there is a lot more to talk about for sure. But I appreciate your getting this out to the world, everything that you do.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.
All right. You too. Thanks.